Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on preventing pasture problems through observing pastures and livestock. My name is Deb Haliba and I work at the University of Vermont Extension as eOrganic's Dairy Team Coordinator. eOrganic is an organic agriculture community of practice with eExtension, and you can find all of our published articles, videos, and upcoming and recorded webinars at eextension.org/organic_production. Today's webinar is being made possible with funding from the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education Center and USDA NIFA. If you do plan to share the recording or the information presented today with others, we'd greatly appreciate acknowledgement of eOrganic and today's speaker. Okay, so before we get started, I wanted to give a quick overview of today's agenda. Sarah will give her presentation for about 50 minutes, and then finally we'll transition to our question and answer session for the remainder of our time together. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Sarah Flack is a consultant specializing in grass-based and organic livestock production. She has degrees in environmental agriculture and biology and plant and soil sciences from the University of Vermont. For more than 20 years, Sarah has been providing grazing and organic management education to farmers and ag service providers. And she also spends some of her time as an organic certification inspector for several organizations across the U.S. Sarah grew up on a grass-based livestock farm in northern Vermont, where she still lives today, and I'm happy that she's right next to me here on the UVM campus. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah. Welcome, Sarah.
Great, thank you. The goal of my presentation today is to share a little bit of information about a whole lot of really interesting topics to hopefully help all of us better understand how the different types of plants in our pastures respond to different types of grazing management. And so hopefully by the end of today you'll have a better sense of some of the plant physiology and the different types of plants out there and what happens when you do things like change the stocking density, or if you choose a grazing management system that has a taller pre-grazing height or a shorter pre-grazing height, or you decide to start leaving more pasture behind or trample more pasture in your grazing management system. And so I'm also going to, so I'll start out talking about things from the plant's perspective, and I'm going to talk about both the grazing adapted plants and the non-grazing adapted plants, because I think that's a great way to start to think more about how plants respond to grazing. We'll also talk about the needs of grazing livestock very briefly, and we'll talk a little bit about how to observe both the plants and the animals so that we can learn more about what they're telling us about how our management system is working or maybe not working in the pastures. And we'll also talk a little bit about how nicely the grazing adapted plants needs and the herbivores, the grazing animals needs, go together in creating these good grazing management systems. And my goal anytime I'm doing consulting or teaching on grazing management is to hopefully help all of you farmers better understand the underlying principles behind good grazing management. So that way you'll be able to make a really well-informed decision about what type of grazing management is the best fit for your farm and your family farm goals. Because there's lots of new terms and old terms in the popular agricultural press, and it's sometimes pretty confusing to know which type of grazing management to pick. So I'll definitely spend some time talking about the fundamental principles of good grazing systems. So not all of this information is new. A lot of it is really old. We just have new technology to help us understand things better. And so this is a quote from 1898, which says that the management of the pasture is even of more importance than the selection of the seed and the preparation of the land. And so my emphasis today is going to be on the grazing management practices, and that's not because I think the soil fertility or reseeding with improved forage species isn't important. The soil is very important. The selection of the right plant species is really important. But what I commonly see on farms is that resources and money and time is being spent on soil fertilizers and on reseeding. But if the grazing system hasn't been set up so that the way that the animals are grazing the plants isn't being done in a way to actually improve the pastures over time, you can waste a whole lot of money on fertilizers and seeds. And so I'm going to have the emphasis today really be on the grazing management itself. So we're going to start out talking about the plants, and this is an example of a bunch of grazing adapted plants. And by that I mean plants that do their best when they are defoliated, grazed off and eaten and trampled by herbivores, by the cows. I'm really going to be talking about organic dairy cows mostly today, but this applies to beef cows and to sheep and goats also. And so these are the plants that like to be grazed off, and then, but not too short. They even like being trampled a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit about which plants actually don't like to be trampled as much as others. And then they like plenty of time to grow back to the ideal pre-grazing height, and that varies a little bit with which plant we're talking about and your management goal. So this pasture here is a mixture of cool season perennial grasses, some white clover and red clover, some plantain, some dandelion. These are all grazing adapted plants. So before I get into some detail about the grazing plants, I want to talk in detail about the grasses and then the clovers. I want to talk briefly about the non-grazing adapted species, just so that we can contrast how they respond to grazing management, because it is quite different. So these are actually a series of slides that I think my dad took on my family farm back in the 70s and the 80s. And he was using what was called back then mob stalking. These days it gets called mob grazing. But mob stalking was putting a whole lot of animals in a really small paddock, so high density grazing, and using them to rapidly defoliate by grazing and also trampling the plants. And the response, starting out here on the top left slide, you can kind of see a before and an after effect. On the right-hand side of the fence here, that's what it looked like before, and then there's a high tensile fence here, and this is what it looked like after several years of this mob stalking, just using animals to frequently defoliate the plants and trample things, and then taking them out of the area and letting it grow back. And so this allows the non-grazing plants, and you can see over here in the right-hand slide, these plants have been defoliated and they're not doing great. They're not growing back very well. The repeated defoliation is not something that these non-grazing adapted plants like. And so over the course of a couple of years of repeated defoliation, these brushy plants are dying out and they're being naturally replaced by these grasses and clovers that are coming in underneath. And then eventually, you can see in the bottom slide, after several years, the clover and grasses in the understory are pretty productive, and the only non-grazing adapted plants that survived this process were the taller trees that were a little too tall and mature to be completely defoliated by the grazing animals. So this is how the non-grazing adapted plants versus the grazing adapted plants adapt or respond to grazing management. The ones that are not adapted die, and it's a great way to be able to kill brush without spending money on reseeding and fertilizing and brush hogging and chainsawing, and to be able to naturally change things over to the grazing adapted species. And I'll just mention one other thing about those non-grazing adapted plants for any of you who are attempting to do some forest grazing or silvo grazing, or perhaps include some browse pasture in your grazing management. That is very challenging. It is possible, but it's important to keep in mind that you're grazing non-grazing adapted plants that don't really like that repeated defoliation. So for the rest of today, I'm going to talk about grazing adapted species, and these are the ones that, if managed correctly, create the dairy quality pasture that we really need in order to be able to make milk and pay the bills as dairy farmers. So I'm going to start talking about grass in some detail, and then I'll shift gears and talk about the legumes before we start talking about things then from the cow's perspective. So this is a series of slides that have been loaned to us by Sid Bosworth at the University of Vermont. And he's got at least one webinar already recorded on the eOrganic website, and he does a really great workshop on Pasture Plant Identification, in which he talks quite a bit about the physiology of pasture plants. And so I'm just borrowing a few of his slides to talk about some of the important grass anatomy parts that we should be paying attention to as we're watching how our pastures respond to grazing management. So when we first walk into our pasture and are thinking about whether it's ready for us to put the cows in there to graze it, we're typically just going to be seeing the upper parts of the grasses. We'll be seeing the leaves, and if it's June or July in the northeast here when all of the grass plants are flowering, we'll also see the seed stems and seed heads. And so these are the obvious parts of the plants that we're always looking at, but I would really encourage everybody to spend some time actually getting down on your hands and knees and crawling around in your pastures and looking at what is really on the soil surface. So some of the important parts of the grass plants that we want to be observing include the very base of the plant here, the crown, which is where a lot of the growth comes out of, but it's also where these grass plants in the pastures store quite a bit of their energy, the carbohydrate reserve that they're using so that they've got some energy to regrow from the next time they've been completely grazed off by a cow and they need to somehow have enough energy to grow a whole lot new leaves and stems back. So that's the first part to notice on the grasses is the crown. And then there's also a couple of lateral organs that come off of the grasses, stolons and rhizomes. And these are important because in the grasses that produce these, you will get these additional little grass plants starting to grow out of these side shoots. And so the other part of the plant I want to talk about is these tillers. So this is a tiller here coming out of the stolon, and then there's some side tillers coming right out of the crown of the plant. And these tillers are something that's really important to pay attention to in the pasture because this is how our really productive, highly palatable pasture grass species spread through the pasture and increase in plant density. And so the more we can take care of these little tillers, the more grass plants we'll have in the pasture, filling in any bare soil and improving the pasture density so then the cows can get more dry matter per bite when they go in and graze. And then, of course, another way that the skip that one. All right. Oh, it's coming back now. Another way that the grasses spread, of course, is by seed, and so those seed heads will produce some seed, and sometimes there'll also be some frost seeding that you might be doing to introduce some grasses in. But as much as possible, if you're able to use these tillers coming out of the sides of the grass plants to increase the plant density, that would be great. So I don't know if this slide is showing up perfectly for you guys, but it's just highlighting the difference between the bunch grasses and the sod-forming grasses. The bunch grasses have a different growth habit than the sod-forming grasses. So the bunch grasses are going to have their tillers only coming out of the basal area of the plant, whereas the sod-forming grasses are going to have tillers coming out from these side shoots, which might be stolons and they may be the rhizomes. So a little more detail on the bunch grasses and some of the bunch grasses that you might typically have in your pastures. These are going to be your Timothy. Orchard grass is the really classic bunch grass that we all think about. You can see those bunches. If you've got a mixed pasture, you'll see the tall tufts of orchard grass growing in your pastures. And again, these are ones that they're not going to send out these long side lateral shoots with the tillers. This additional tillers are just going to come off the base area of the grass. So then the sod-forming grasses, are going to be the ones that have the tillers. The tillers, sorry, we're having minor slide difficulties here. Deb is helping out though. The sod-forming grasses are the ones that, the classic one that you'll think of is Kentucky bluegrass, which in particularly a sheep pasture where it might be being managed with a fairly short pre-grazing height, you'll end up with this incredibly dense pasture with white clover and Kentucky bluegrass. And those are the pastures where if you crawl around on your hands and knees and kind of part the plants, it's really hard to see the soil. It creates this real nice density. But some of the other sod-forming grasses that will create a taller growing sward in your pasture are smooth brome grass, reed canary grass, and even quackgrass, which, although is a weed, is also a really great pasture grass. So there are also a couple of different growing characteristics in the grasses, and this includes plants which regrow by elevating their growing point. So they'll actually be growing taller and elevating the growing point, and this includes plants like timothy, brome grass, and reed canary grass. So these will be some of the plants that you'll, especially if you're doing a tall pre-grazing height, you'll notice these plants will really start to dominate the pasture because they'll do really well with that extra long regrowth period and being allowed to grow tall before they're grazed off again. And then we've got grass plants that are really just going to regrow mostly from the crown, and this includes orchard grass, tall fescue, perennial ryegrasses, and then the Kentucky bluegrass. So a lot of different ways that the pasture plants are growing, and that's going to affect how they all respond to different grazing methods. This is just another example, in this case, of a Kentucky bluegrass plant, so that you can see here's the crown of the plant. That's the part that will be pretty obvious for us to see. And then you can see there's these new tillers forming. This lower part would be underground, and here's some little roots coming out, and this would be a new tiller. And then further out here, we can see new tillers forming farther out from the plant. But what it's really going to look like when we're just crawling around on our knees in the pastures and looking down and trying to find what these little side tillers look like is, to start with, especially if you've got a nice dense pasture, it might take you a little while to find what these new tillers look like. So I tried to take a photo of one here. So you can see it's this new little grass plant emerging. It's got a central stem and a few leaves coming out of it. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about the clovers, the legumes, the clovers and the alfalfa, I should say. And so these, like the grasses, come in two main kind of growing style categories. We have the horizontally growing plants, the classic one being white clover, which is our most grazing adapted legume. The stem of the clover, or the stolon, grows right along the soil surface. And so when it grows up, its leaves, just the stem of the leaf and the leaf go up. And so when the cows graze off the clover, they're not actually eating the growing point. They're just eating the leaves and the leaf stems, which means it's very well grazing adapted because it's got an intact growing point ready to send up another leaf right after it's been grazed. Then the other types of legumes that we've got in the pastures grow more like the bunch grasses, where they've got a crown, and then the plant is growing up from this crown without these horizontal stolons going out the side. And this includes things like red clover, alfalfa, and alsike. So this is how these legumes look in the pasture all growing together. You can see the white clover over on the left side here are lower growing, and they've got the stems running right along the soil surface. And there are different categories of white clover. Some of them do tend to grow larger leaves and be taller, and some of them are a little bit shorter, but they all have the same growth habit. And then there are also these upright growing, so this is the red clover, and then this is the alfalfa. So I want to point out another really important kind of physiological difference between some of these clovers that will also affect how it responds to grazing management. And this is where the crown is located in these different legumes. And this is true for some of the grasses also. Some of them have this crown more up above the soil surface, and some of them, the crown is kind of snugged down into the soil a little bit more. And so this means that things like alfalfa might not respond quite so well if you're using a very short pre-grazing, post-grazing height. So if you are grazing your pastures down really short, especially if it's so short that you're letting the animals actually consume and eat the crown of the plant, you're going to very quickly lose that alfalfa plant, whereas some of these other plants might be a little bit more resistant to that short post-grazing height. The other thing that you can do that will cause the alfalfa and some of these other plants that have a crown that's well above the soil surface to die out over time is sometimes if you're grazing with a very high stock density and you are doing a lot of trampling, you can sometimes damage the crowns of the plant even with that. But in general, these plants, all of them are going to do better if you do leave a little bit more of residue behind and not graze the plants down really, really short. And that's particularly true for any of the grasses and the legumes that have a crown that is above the ground. The grasses that have the crowns above the ground, I skipped over that, include things like timothy is a really classic one. If you look at the base of the timothy plant on the soil surface, it actually has a little bulged area right above the soil surface. And so that's another one that really does better if it doesn't get grazed very, very short. So now that we've talked in detail about the legumes and the grasses, I want to go over the grazing guidelines, the kind of fundamental principles of all good grazing management systems. And these include the need for a variable recovery period, which is based on our observation of how fast the pasture plants are growing. So you're observing your pasture and you're making sure that you are always letting the entire pasture fully regrow and recover to the ideal pre-grazing height before you put the animals back in. And then the other important guideline for a good grazing management system is to have those periods of occupation be as short as possible, so that prevents the animals from regrazing the same plants in that same grazing period. And it also, if it's a nice short period of occupation, you're also much less likely to have the animals grazing the plants down too short and consuming some of those lower parts of the plant, like the plant crowns, that they'd prefer not to have grazed off. So then looking at the graph on the right-hand side here, this is an example of looking at how the cool season forages that we were just talking about, the grasses and the clovers I was talking about, are the cool season perennials, and their growth curve is in the green. So you can see that they grow very vigorously in the spring and the early part of the summer. And coincidentally, this large amount of forage that they're producing at this time of the year is also when all of those cool season perennial grasses are producing their seeds and their flowers. And so you're not just getting leaves then, you're also getting a lot of stems, a lot of seed heads, a lot of flowers. And so there's a lot of volume there, but it also includes quite a bit of less digestible forage, less digestible fiber in there. So that's one of our challenges with this type of mix of plants. The other challenge then is that the rate of plant growth slows down quite a bit here before it picks up later in the summer or early fall for another nice burst of very nice vegetative pasture growth. And so this is why the variable recovery periods are so important, because if we're not varying those recovery periods in the paddocks, when we get to this summer slump or the forage gap, this is the time of the year when you're most likely to do overgrazing damage to your perennial pastures. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So very conveniently, for those of you who are able to grow some warm season forages, which up north will often be grown as an annual, but down south might be a perennial, their growth habit overlaps pretty nicely with the summer slump or this forage gap. And so some examples of how people are doing this is this upper slide here is taken by Cindy Daly, and that's using some forage brassicas to extend the grazing season into the fall. And then this is Brent Beidler using Japanese millet in the midsummer during this slump to be able to provide some really high quality forage to his cows and not overstress and overgraze his perennial pastures. So then there's a bunch of other strategies that people use for getting through that forage gap or the midsummer slump, and that includes harvesting a bunch of extra forage as hay or baleage or haylage in the earlier part of the summer, and then letting those pastures grow back in and adding them back into the grazing rotation later. And so that's the most common way that you'll see people being able to maintain that critically important variable recovery period and give those plants enough rest. But then also irrigation will help out. This is a western irrigation system in eastern Oregon. And then more farmers actually, even in the Northeast, this is a farm in Vermont who's just recently added an irrigation system down in the bottom left to try to increase the amount of grass growth during that summer gap. But I'm not going to talk about the harvesting technology or irrigation technology, and I'm also not going to talk a lot about using annual crops to get through the gap, because I really want to stay focused today on the perennial grazing adapted plants and the tools that we have just using our cows and our knowledge of how plants respond to grazing management. And so the tools that I want to talk about today include stocking density, and I'll define that term to start with, because stocking density is not the same as stocking rate. Stocking rate is the total number of cows on your whole farm. Stocking density is the number of cows in a specific area at a specific time. And so it's the number of pounds of cow per acre, or the number of cows per paddock, depending on how you track things on your farm. That's stocking density. And stocking density has a huge effect on plants. But it's also not always easy for people to have a very high stock density all the time. Because in order to have a high stock density, you generally need to have smaller paddocks and move the animals more frequently. And so some farms will have a labor limitation and won't be able to do the very high stock density grazing. Another thing that we can vary to change how the plants are responding and doing under grazing management is the pre-grazing height. And if any of you have read at all recently about any of the grazing articles and grazing publications, there's a lot of emphasis on taller pre-grazing heights. And before you decide which pre-grazing height you want to adopt, I think it's really important to think about the plants that you have currently growing in your perennial pastures and what height they really like to be grazed at, and what your goal is for what you'd like to have growing in those pastures, because you can completely change the plant species composition in your pasture by changing your pre-grazing height and your post-grazing height. And residue, the next word here, refers to what you leave behind, which is not just the post-grazing height, how tall you have the cows graze the pasture down to, but also what they've trampled and left behind. And so, for example, if you choose a very short pre-grazing height for your animals, over time you're going to select for plants in that pasture that do better with a short pre-grazing height, which is going to be probably a very dense, shorter pasture that's going to be mostly Kentucky bluegrass and white clover. But if you choose to have a much taller pre-grazing height, you're going to encourage some of the other grass species, such as timothy and brome grass, red clover and alfalfa, and the taller growing plants. And then, of course, a really important tool in our grazer's toolbox is the length of the regrowth period, which is how long we let the pastures regrow. And that is commonly where I see either the most benefit on farms where they're increasing the length of that regrowth period, and also I see farms doing a lot of damage if they have a regrowth period which is too short. So some of the other tools that we have as grazers include trampling, and this slide is a great example of a nice post-grazing residue where this mixed herd of beef and dairy animals have grazed this area down very nicely with a high stock density, and their manure is nicely evenly distributed because they've been in a relatively small paddock for a short period of time, and they've trampled a lot of the residue in, so this area is going to grow back very vigorously and nicely. They haven't grazed it down too short, they haven't trampled it too much, but it's nicely knocked down, so when they come back in to graze it the next time, it'll be as nice as a dairy quality pasture where somebody went through with a mower after the grazing. So by using this high stock density and doing the trampling, this farm has avoided the need to have to go in and do any post clipping. So a nice herd effect here. So talking a little bit more about the pasture plants and what they really like in order to grow as vigorously and as possible. They like a short period of occupation and a long recovery period, and the worst thing you can do for them is a long period of occupation where you leave them in the paddock for many days or weeks, or worse yet, months, and then you give those same plants a really short recovery period. That will very rapidly damage not just the upper parts of the plant that you visually see when you look at your pasture, but the root system underneath will also become really stunted and less productive. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of two different grazing systems which are very different from each other, and they're both working really well, because I think it's important as you learn more about the underlying guidelines of good grazing management and you start to learn more about these pasture plants and how you can manage them. It's important to understand that you actually have a lot of flexibility in how to design your grazing system for your farm, as long as you're not damaging the plants by violating any of the basic rules of what you need to do to keep the pasture plants happy. You've got a lot of flexibility. So this is a farm in New York State who is a long-time farm that has not fed grain to their dairy cows. This is Rob and Pam Moore's farm. You can see their cows look very nice, and they are doing a high-density grazing. They've got the cows up against the poly wire here that they'll be moving forward to give them another strip of grass shortly. So this is a system where they're not using any supplemental feed in the barn. At this time of the year, they're just getting all of their dry matter intake from pasture, and it's very successful for them. So this next slide is an example of another very successful organic dairy farm, but a very different system. This farm, one of their goals is to make quite a lot of milk per cow. So they have a very high herd average. Their herd is largely Holstein, but also has some Jerseys in it. And they do feed both supplemental grain, primarily as an energy source, and then also some baleage in the barn, along with very high quality pasture. And they are not using as high a stocking density as the Moores are, but they are moving the cows anywhere from 2 to 3 times a day to a new paddock. So a very different grazing system, but also equally as successful in meeting this very different farm goals. This is on Earl Fournier's farm up in northern Vermont. So continuing to talk about things now from the cow's perspective, I love this slide. This is also on Earl Fournier's farm. It shows the cow using her tongue to very carefully grab a mouthful of this really high dairy quality pasture and pull it into her mouth. And then she'll bite it off by pinching it between her gums and her teeth. And in this case, you can see that this is going to be a very nice, lush pasture. She's not going to have to chew it very much, and it's going to be really pretty easy for her to fill her rumen with this stuff pretty quickly. And so from the animal's perspective, we really want to make sure that every bite that she takes is as big as possible, and that every bite she takes is as high a quality as possible. And that's the ideal way to be able to let the cow really maximize dry matter intake from pasture. And there's a whole webinar on this topic that is by Karen Hoffman that is on the eOrganic website, which is a whole webinar just on maximizing dry matter intake from pasture. That is where you can get a lot more detail on this. But I wanted to mention one thing on this topic, which is that cows can only take a certain number of bites per day. And then they need to go do a whole lot of other things that cows need to do, like take a nap and chew their cuds and walk around. And so because they can only take a certain number of bites per day, each bite they take really needs to count. It needs to be high quality, and it needs to be a large bite. And so from the cow's perspective, we need to manage the pasture so that those bites are as good as possible. So how do we do that? Very conveniently, these being grazing adapted plants, being grazed by the plants that they evolved with. In order to maximize pasture dry matter intake, what works best is to put the cows in the paddock for short periods of times, and then to make sure that once you take the animals out of the paddock, that you're giving it enough time to regrow back to that ideal pre-grazing height that has that maximum amount of dry matter per bite in it. And conveniently, what we do in order to improve our pastures, using our animal impact and grazing as the tool to improve our pastures, so we don't have to spend too much money on seeds and reseeding, is to have a short period of occupation, and then to make sure those regrowth periods are long enough to allow the plants to fully recover, regrow their roots, and recharge both the crowns and the roots of the plant with plenty of energy for the next regrowth period. So this is where it's just really great to look at how beautifully co-evolved the plants and the animals are in these well-managed systems. So now we'll look at a few of the challenges and potential pasture problems that we can run into in actually trying to make these systems work in reality on our farms. Our goal is for the pasture to be tall enough so that the plants are fully recovered, but we'd prefer not to have the plants, particularly in these dairy quality pastures, become really over-mature. And by that, I don't mean a bunch of over-mature leaves. I'm really talking about too many seed stems and too much lignification, where the seed stems are becoming very woody and much more straw-like. So we want to keep our pastures, from the cow's perspective, somewhere in the middle here, so that the plants are fully recovered, there's lots of dry matter there, but we haven't let the whole place turn into an overmature hayfield with a lot of seed heads in it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the two extremes of either too much fiber or too much protein in pastures, because these are the two common pitfalls that I see, particularly with farmers who are just starting out with grazing management, or particularly on farms who are trying to significantly reduce or even eliminate the amount of grain that they're feeding to go to one of the zero grain systems. So we need to be paying attention to digestibility of the pasture plants, particularly if your pastures are mostly cool season perennial grasses that like to make all of their seed heads at the same time in June or July. And so if we're looking at forage tests, we should be looking at the NDF number as we think about the digestibility. NDF stands for neutral detergent fiber. And this number will increase as the plants mature and we get more of these less digestible stems in there. And NDF is a predictor of rumen fill, or how much dry matter you can actually pack into a cow and have flow through the cow. So as the amount of NDF and non-digestible fiber in the pasture increases, it reduces how much the cow can actually eat. By slowing down her rate of passage so that there's just not as much stuff able to flow through her digestive system. So even though she might look full, she might not be having her nutritional needs met. And so on the other hand, if the NDF starts to go down, if you're then grazing pastures which are more vegetative and leafy and less stemmy, then that lower NDF will mean that the cows can actually eat more dry matter intake from the pasture, and more feed will be flowing through the cow faster. But we also don't want to go too far into the other extreme, which is where the feed is flowing through the cow way too fast. We'll show some pictures of manure in a minute too. So the other kind of end of the problem spectrum that we can see in the pasture is pastures which are very high in protein on farms where the supplemental feed in the barn also includes too much protein. And so if the grain includes too much protein, particularly something like soy in it, or if the supplemental feed in the barn is something like baleage that's high in protein, then you're going to have too much protein in the diet, and a couple of things will happen. One is you may see elevated blood urea nitrogen and milk urea nitrogen numbers, and quite a few of the organic milk companies now will give you these numbers so you can monitor this in your herd over the summer. And this can compromise the health of both the cow and the calves. And the cows, in some cases, will lose condition. It's harder to get them bred back. And the other thing that happens in situations with feeding too much protein in the barn and then sending them out into a pasture which is high in protein is that the cows will get picky and they won't really want to graze the pasture as much. And so if any of you have had that situation where you're feeding say a 16% or an 18% grain or some nice high protein haylage in the barn, and then the cows go out to this lovely lush pasture and they just don't want to eat it, that's often just caused by the cow's kind of biological feedback saying, no, I've already had plenty of protein. What I'd really like now is some energy. And so if you reduce the amount of protein in the barn, add in more energy in the barn, that herd of cows might be more likely to graze those lush, vegetative, higher protein pastures. So I'm going to just go through a few of the cow monitoring tools that we can be thinking about. And that includes rumen fill, body condition, rate of gain of some of the younger heifers, how much milk that the cows are making, and also some measures of how they're doing reproductively. So rumen fill is by looking at this spot right here on the cow, which is underneath the short ribs on the left side of the cow. And I had a great professor at UVM who taught me a way to remember which side of the cow to look at so that I could see where the rumen was. And it was that lunch is on the left and reproduction is on the right. And that's still how I remind myself which side of the cow to look at. So from the cow's perspective, it's on the left under the short ribs. And you're looking there to see if this area is perhaps sunken in which case you know the cow is not getting enough dry matter and there's something going on with her. But you're also looking to see if it's really full. And just being full isn't necessarily a good thing, because if it's really full and she's grazing pasture which is really low digestibility, as we were talking about in 2 slides ago, she might be really full of fiber but still not really getting all of her nutritional needs met. But rumen fill is definitely the first thing I look at in the pasture. But then I'm going to combine that with looking at body condition, because that's the measure of how much fat is on the cow, kind of padding her. And that combined with rumen fill will really help you figure out if their nutritional needs are being met, particularly if you're then also able to look at milk production. Then in the young stock on the farm, you can also look at rate of gain. And then one of the things that I think is very helpful to look at are a couple of different measures of reproductive performance in how the herd is doing overall. And I like to look at days in milk to see if when the herd is out on pasture, to make sure the cows are getting bred back and staying bred back. Because if they're not getting bred back on time, that might indicate that we've got some nutritional issues going on with our supplemental feeding or pasture. And then another number I like to look at is the calving interval. So how many months it is between calving, how long is it taking us to get the cows bred back. Particularly for farms who are cutting the grain out of the ration, this is a really important thing to monitor to make sure you're still able to get enough energy into the cows when they're out on lush pasture so that they're able to breed back well. And body condition scoring is something that your veterinarian might be able to do for you, and a couple of the dairy testing services will actually, when they come out to do milk weights, they'll also do some body condition scoring for you a couple times a year. And then we can't talk about monitoring cows without talking about cow pies, because they can tell us a huge amount about what the cows are eating and how they're doing. And we could probably do a whole slide presentation just on cow pies. So I'm just going to put this one slide up. This is from Karen Hoffman, who's got a couple of other webinars on the eOrganic website. But this is just an example of how to look at the cow manure out on the pasture and then think about what it's telling us about the nutritional quality of both the pasture and additional supplemental feed that you might be feeding them in the barn. So this is pasture manure score number 1, which is the more kind of splattery manure. And actually, I'm sure those of you who have cows out on lush pasture in the spring see much more splattery manure than this. It's just a little hard to capture it in one slide because it'll go over 3 or 4 feet because the manure will get so liquidy, and that is in response to those high protein situations. And so sometimes that splattery manure just means, you know, wow, you've got a lot of protein, soluble protein going through those cows from the pasture, and you may want to think about a little bit more energy supplementation in the barn. Sometimes it can also indicate a health issue. And then on the other end of the spectrum is you also want to be looking out for, particularly if the pasture is highly fibrous, you want to be looking out for cow pies that are getting really solid and are full of non-digestible fibers. So now I'm going to shift gears and talk about some of the pasture observations that we can do and kind of biological monitoring of our pasture ecosystems. And there's a whole bunch of trainings that you can do on this topic, and I'm going to give a few resources at the end for where you can go and get a little bit more detail on some of the pasture monitoring and ecosystem measuring that you can do out in your pastures. So the slide that was just up there was an example of overgrazing damage, and frequently when I get called to go out to a farm to help a farmer figure out why some pasture is just not growing well, in the slide before it was that it was full of ferns. A lot of times, the first thing that the neighbors have suggested to the farmer is that it needs lime, or there's something wrong with the soil or something like that. But very often the main cause of problems in the pasture is overgrazing damage. And so this is the number one pasture pitfall I see from the plant's perspective. So overgrazing damage happens anytime that livestock graze a plant while it's still growing from its carbohydrate reserves instead of from active photosynthesis. So if it's growing from energy in the crown or the roots of the plant instead of from leafy green area photosynthesizing, then you're doing overgrazing damage. And overgrazing damage also happens when animals are left in a paddock for too long or returned to the paddock too soon before the plants are recovered. So this is a photo of the plants at the most critical time where you do not want to have the cows go back in and regraze this area. These are plants that have been grazed off sometime in the previous week, and they've already grown up several inches of nice kind of pale green new leaf material. The white clover plants have popped up a whole bunch of new leaves. And if you were a cow, this looks pretty good. You'd want to go back in and eat it up. But from the plant's perspective, they are depleting their carbohydrate energy reserves, regrowing these leaves, and they really need several more weeks of regrowth so that they can turn dark green and start photosynthesizing before the cows go back in and regraze it. So here are some of the most common overgrazing situations that I see. One of them is in the fall when you take all of the fences down, take all your paddock divisions down, and just let the cows in there to kind of clean up the pastures and make it look all nice and tidy for the winter. That actually can do quite a bit of damage to those fall pastures if they're in there for a long time or grazing it down too short. If you've got a fixed rotational grazing system, so instead of varying the amount of time you give the plants to regrow, if instead you're always going back in the same amount of time, inevitably at some point you'll be putting them into the paddock before it's fully regrown and doing some overgrazing damage. And then anytime you leave the animals in the paddock for more than about 3 days, you're very likely doing some overgrazing damage. And that depends a little bit on the climate and the weather. In some cases you might be able to leave them in for 5 days, but the 3-day rule is a good one to follow if you're using longer periods of occupation than a half a day or a day. And then another place I see overgrazing damage happen is if you're going in and post-clipping after grazing, but you're waiting a couple of days so that then when you go in and clip, you're actually clipping off some of the regrowth along with the plant material that they left behind. So I'm going to start with a few slides so we can just look at what the results of overgrazing damage look like. This one's really obvious. It looks like a putting green in a golf course, and no matter how long you let this one regrow, it's probably not going to grow very tall. That's a kind of a permanently damaged from overgrazing. But then some of the other things that you might observe will be animal trails forming is a sure sign of overgrazing damage. In this case, we're actually starting to get some soil erosion forming on the hillside. So then more typical overgrazing is these pastures that look just sort of patchy, and you can see there's some areas that are tall. Cows, for whatever reason, just don't seem to want to eat that. These are the zones of repugnance or rejected forage. And then there's these areas where the cows keep returning to over and over, which are very short, like that previous slide, and not growing very tall, that have really been permanently stunted by the overgrazing damage. Oops, wrong direction. So then, but this is also overgrazing. So this is a pasture where I'm standing on the side of the road to take this photo. So from the road, it looks like there's quite a lot of forage material out there. But if you actually walk out into this pasture, you can see that there are short patchy areas, just like in the previous slide, where the cows keep returning to graze. And then at the same time, those rejected areas are tall. In this case, they're starting to grow up into weeds and even some woody, non-grazing adapted species. And then what happens in that sort of low stock density, continuous grazing with overgrazing damage is this left-hand side of the slide here is what it looks like after about 10 or 15 years of overgrazing damage. So overgrazing damage doesn't always show up as really, really short. Sometimes it shows up as reverting back into brushy areas just because of the selective grazing. And then on the right side of the slide here, this is exactly the same soil type. It's not a great soil type. This is a pretty wet, low fertility area. But this area has been using management intensive grazing, and over time this has gotten gradually better and better as the brushy species have died out and been replaced by better grazing adapted, higher quality species. So just talking a little bit more about pasture monitoring, some of the things that I'm looking out for is weed species, whether there are more or less of them, plant vigor, and not just looking at vigor at a given point in time, but thinking about plant vigor throughout the whole grazing season to see if there are certain times of the year where the pasture is really not productive and how we can change our management to improve that. Plant density is really important, as we've talked about before. The diversity of plants, and ideally we'd like to see more perennial plants and less annual plants in these pastures. Thatch or residue being left behind on the soil surface. It can be good and bad depending on the situation. Biological activity is fun to monitor by looking at how fast your cow pies decompose. And then of course we're also wanting to make sure that we don't have increasing amounts of bare soil, that we're not getting a crust or capping on any soil, so that we've got good water infiltration and we don't want to see any soil erosion. And I'll give you some resources at the end for where you can go and do some pasture monitoring in more detail if you want more training or some worksheets to do that. So I just want to show, this one slide is really interesting because it points out the importance of pasture monitoring and also really thinking through what you're seeing and how it relates to past management. So the left side of the slide here, you can see this is taken in the fall, and we've just taken down a polywire fence that ran right up the middle of this pasture here. And on the left side, where the grass is a little bit taller, the cows were left for about a week and were grazing in the fall, and the plants were still growing just a little bit, but pretty much growth was stopped. And then this polywire fence got put up and they got left on the right side for another 2 or 3 weeks and grazed the pasture down a bit shorter. And then the next spring, this was the same area. You can see there's this, where the polywire line was, running up the middle of the slide. On the left-hand side, you can see that those pasture plants are turning green and have grown quite a lot of leaf area already, whereas on the right-hand side, where those cows got left for longer, things are just barely getting going, or maybe not at all. And so this is an example of two things. One is in the fall, those cows were grazing the area to the right down shorter than those plants would like, and they were probably consuming some of the crowns, and so some of those carbohydrate storage areas in the plants. But remember looking at those slides of the tillers earlier on, those new little plant parts to create new plants, new grass plants. And they were probably eating off quite a lot of those little secondary tillers at that point too, which will also really set the pasture back. So this is a great example of how pasture observation skills can help us learn what we did and then start to change some of our management. I think one of the other really important things to monitor is how much residue you're leaving behind and what that residue is like in the pasture. And a lot of pasture plants will really do best leaving some residue behind. I've got one more interesting slide here that I just recently took on a farm that has been trying to do grazing with a taller pre-grazing height and trying to do what's called these days mob grazing with a high stock density. But it's a farm that has a fairly small herd size, and so they weren't able to get a really good herd effect and trample the pastures down really well. And so as a result, they were getting nice pre-grazing heights, nice and tall, but then when the cows went through and grazed the areas, they were leaving a lot of residue that wasn't really trampled in, and so there was a lot of continuous shading going on in the pasture. And so over time, this pasture actually started to decrease in plant density as some of the plants in the understory got shaded out. And so this farm is changing their grazing techniques a little bit to either use a shorter pre-grazing height at least one time a year to allow a little bit more or decrease the shading in the lower part. And they're also doing a little bit of post-clipping until their herd size can be big enough to get a better herd mob effect and have a good trampling effect. So it's just an example of how some of the changes that you might need to make on your farm over time as you're adjusting to some new grazing techniques. This is just an example of low plant density and also some capping that I was talking about, where the soil is crusty and you get poor water infiltration into the pasture. So there's an article on my website that Heather Darby and I wrote on kind of pasture ecosystem monitoring, and this is just a summary of some of the information in that article. And these are signs that you might be looking out for that tell you that the pasture is not improving as much as you'd like it to be, which is you're seeing fewer plant species, lower species diversity, increasing numbers of annuals and losing perennial plants. You're seeing more bare soil visible between the plants and slower plant growth, perhaps a shorter season of productive growth, and low biological activity. Those cow pies are just not breaking down and rotting into the soil as quickly as you'd like. On the other hand, in an improving pasture where you realize that whatever management system that you're using is making a difference and making things get better, the things you'll be seeing would be plant spacing is getting closer, so you're getting more plant density and less bare soil visible between the plants. Ideally, in a really high-quality pasture, you shouldn't be able to see any soil between the plants. You'd be seeing more rapid plant growth, and the plant growth being rapid over a longer growing period. You'd be seeing higher soil biological activity, so those cow pies are breaking down more rapidly, increasing plant species, and more perennials in the pasture. So this is just a reminder that even if you have a nicely set up pasture system with your paddocks and your water systems and your lane, it's still possible to be doing a not so good job of grazing those pastures. And so it is really important for each of us to understand these fundamental underlying principles of good grazing management, because then we've got a lot of flexibility to design a grazing system that really works best for ourselves. So the pasture ecosystem monitoring resources that I was telling you about are these bottom two websites here. There's two of them. One is the NRCS website, and they have a pasture condition scoring worksheet, which is a nice, relatively simple worksheet that you can use to walk around your pastures and monitor kind of how things are changing in the ecosystem over time in your pastures. And then if you want more in-depth, a very interesting bunch of information about it, Holistic Management has a whole biological monitoring system which teaches you how to monitor the pasture ecosystem and the whole farm ecosystem. And then on my website, you can find that article by Heather Darby and I on pasture ecosystem monitoring. And then the top resource here is where you can see some of the other webinars that I was mentioning. And wow, we actually stayed on time.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really great. So now we're going to just move on to our question and answer session. So I'm just going to read our questions out loud to Sarah, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. And I'm just going to go right to our...
There's a lot.
Yeah, we have a lot in the queue here. Let's see. Okay, so the first question up here is, can you explain the difference between cool and warm season grasses?
Oh yes, great question. I probably should have put a slide in about that specifically. So the cool season perennial grasses are the ones that are going to be mostly growing up in the northern part of the US and Canada, and most of the grasses I talked about, really all the grasses I talked about in detail, were cool season perennial grasses. The warm season grasses will grow as perennials down further in the south parts of the U.S. and there's up here those will grow more as annuals because they won't make it through the winter, and then as you go further south in the U.S. you'll actually get into another zone of grasses, which are the tropical grasses. So depending on where you are in the country, you might be grazing really just one of those groups of grasses, or you might be grazing a mix of a couple of those groups of grasses.
Sarah, before we move on here, is there anything here that you addressed that would not transfer to grazing sheep and goats?
Yeah, great question. I was actually thinking about that, and I had a few slides of sheep and goats in here that I pulled out as I was trying to keep the presentation short enough and keep it fairly cow-specific. I would say that the two things come to mind. One is sheep and goats are significantly more susceptible to internal parasites. And those internal parasites are, a lot of them you get from grazing, or the animals get them from grazing the lower part of the pasture. And so I might actually emphasize the importance of either having some non-grazing adapted browse species available for sheep and goats, particularly for goats. And I might change the grazing management system a little bit so that you're also breaking up the parasite cycle a little bit with the sheep and goats. And that is a whole complicated topic that I could talk on for a couple of hours. But yeah, those would be the main differences, I would say. And I guess also sheep and goats, they really do enjoy browsing. And so if you do have enough space on your farm that you can have some browse for them, that can be really beneficial. But as I said earlier, those are the non-grazing adapted species of plants that don't do so well under repeated defoliation. So browse management is challenging and interesting.
Do you have any thoughts about pasture soil compaction management from trampling?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't talk at all about soil health monitoring, but that's a whole category of things that I think are really important to be doing as part of the pasture monitoring. I think this is very soil type specific and very climate specific. I've definitely had people ask me if the kind of mob grazing, as it's called these days, is causing soil compaction. My answer is generally not, no. Because you have a very short period of occupation, you're not leaving them in there for days and days and weeks. They're just in there for a very short period of time, and you are leaving a relatively large amount of the pasture plant material behind. You're not grazing it all the way down. So the trampling effect that you're getting is kind of mixing that plant material and the manure into the soil. And I will say I have seen some compaction issues on farms, particularly in clay soils, but it really is kind of soil type specific. But in general, my experience is once you move to shorter periods of occupation and those long recovery periods, the compaction issues are minimized.
Okay, we have a couple of questions about like grazing on leased lands, and connected with that perhaps is a question about sort of where did it go? I'm sorry.
There was a question about electric fence versus permanent fence too.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a good question. I mean, leased land or owned land, you know, the principles are all the same. I would say that the main challenge on leased land is that it does take a certain amount of infrastructure to be able to graze effectively using higher stock densities. And I do think it is incredibly challenging to do good grazing management without using electric fence. I'm a big fan of either portable electric fence or permanent electric fence. Ideally, it's great to have something like a high tensile fence around the perimeter of the large grazing fields, and then your interior subdivisions with either a single strand of polywire for the dairy cows, or you could use multiple strands of polywire if you have well-behaved sheep and goats, or more likely you're going to want to use some of the electric net fence for the sheep and the goats. And that also comes in taller and shorter heights depending on how well-behaved your sheep and goats are. But I definitely have worked with a bunch of farms who are using a lot of leased land, and on those short-term leased pastures, then the challenge really becomes how do you do good grazing management, have the electric fence and the water out there, and not invest a whole lot of permanent funds into this piece of land that you may only have for a couple of years. And I see all sorts of cool, innovative things that farmers are doing, using portable electric fencing and using energizers, perhaps running off of a deep cycle battery or a solar energizer with a portable grounding system. Usually the big challenge with the portable energizers, whether they're solar or you're using them off of a deep cycle battery, is the batteries are very limiting. You really have to keep them charged up for the energizer to be working well. And then also the grounding system still needs to be fairly big, so a lot of times you need to create kind of grounding stations on the leased land where you can bring the energizer and you've already got the ground rods in the ground there so that your ground is adequate to be able to run those portable fences. And then as far as water in the leased land, if you run the water pipe over the soil surface, then you're going to be able to roll it up and take it with you if you can't use the pasture anymore. It's still high labor, but at least it's portable and not buried in the ground.
And maybe related to this leased land question is, this person says, I have pasture that hasn't been grazed, it's overgrown and woody material on top. So how, and I'm sure that folks that are leasing land might face this same sort of similar situation. So this person says, should I mow it before I graze? Well, how do you get it going here?
So the decision about mowing before you graze or after, or brush hogging, it's an interesting one. So there's when it comes to kind of the overgrown brushy pastures, it depends on how quickly you want your pasture to improve. So if you've got patience and you've got a group of lower performance animals, so you don't have high performance dairy animals, or you don't have a bunch of lambs that you need to finish in 6 months on pasture or something like that, then you might just mow the lines where you're going to put the fence in, and then use the animal impact to do the mob grazing, the mob stalking, so that you're repeatedly defoliating those brushy plants and killing them over the course of 3 or 4 years. So that'll be a slower process, but in some ways it can be tidier, especially if those brushy plants aren't really turning into trees quite yet. If you don't have a lot of animals and you need things to go a little bit faster, there can be some real advantage in going in and at least doing a brush hogging of the area every couple of years to stop it from turning into too many kind of woody trees until you can, organize the fence and the livestock to be able to get in there and do the grazing management. I also wanted to say a few things about mowing, pre-clipping and post-mowing, post-grazing mowing, because I didn't really talk about that in detail. But I see farmers doing some really innovative stuff with pre-clipping and post-clipping. And pre-clipping is where if, for example, you're trying to graze a pasture and it's really gotten ahead of you, and it's the time of the year where those grass seed heads have gotten overmature and stemmy and lignified, and the digestibility isn't very good, you can go in and clip those pastures, let it wilt a little bit, and then turn the animals in to graze those areas. And that will actually help them be able to take in more dry matter from the pasture by pre-clipping. I don't see it done a whole lot in Vermont, but I definitely see it done more down in Pennsylvania and parts of New York and Kentucky. Then post-clipping is also another interesting question. Sometimes clipping after you take the cows out of the pasture is worthwhile, and other times it's not. So if you're in the ideal situation where you're able to move your cows frequently and you have small paddock sizes, so you therefore have high stocking density, lots of cows per acre, and you can get a good trampling effect, then even if you're doing a high pre-grazing height and leaving a lot of residue to get behind, the cows are going to trample that down really nicely, and you won't really need to do any post-clipping in those areas. But if you don't have the labor, so you can't maybe move your cows as often as you want, so your paddock sizes are a little bigger with a higher stocking density, and you're not getting a good trampling effect, there may be 1 or 2 times a year where it's going to be worthwhile, if you have high-performance dairy cows or something like that, to do a post-clipping to remove all of those kind of woody seed stems out of the pasture, so that then when it regrows, it will grow back as nice vegetative material. And the trick to that is, if you set your mower too short, you can actually clip off some of the crowns of the plants, and you can, eliminate some of your nice taller growing plants out of your pasture. And then the other thing you want to avoid is make sure you're doing that clipping right after you bring the cows out, so those pasture plants haven't had time to regrow at all. You don't want to end up clipping the fresh new regrowth.
Great. This person asks if about those cattle rejected areas, so places where the cows are seeming to eat. So can those be regenerated over time, and if so, how would you approach that?
Great question. To some degree, it depends a little bit on what you mean by rejected areas. So the classic rejected area in a well-managed pasture is going to be around the cow pie or around the urine spot. They're actually called zones of repugnance, and it's the smelly area around the cow pie where the animal naturally doesn't want to graze. And that will normally be about 10% of the pasture in a well-managed pasture. And that'll look like a lot more than 10% if you're standing on the side of the pasture and you're thinking, should I take the cows out? Should I leave them in there? It doesn't look like they grazed it down well enough. But if you actually walk around through the pasture, it should be around 10%. And so that means, after you graze that pasture 10 times, in theory, a cow pie should have landed on every spot in that pasture. So it's not a bad thing to have those zones of rejected forage. They'll move around each time. You do want to be monitoring to make sure those cow pies are really decomposing and rotting down and are not just sitting there and causing problems by not decomposing. The time that those rejected areas can be problematic is if you've got a low stocking density, so you don't have a lot of animals in the area, because then those rejected areas over time might just start to grow up into weed species. But a lot of time, if you do have a smaller herd size and you're in that sort of a situation, that's where a strategic once-a-year clipping of the pastures can be done so that you've timed it to mow off problem weed species coming up in those zones of repugnance right at the point where those weed species are most susceptible to being mowed off. And a lot of those weeds will just be killed off by that sort of management over time. And I just want to mention that there's going to be a PDF of these slides is getting uploaded, and this is also being recorded, so if you came in late and missed the beginning of the webinar, you can watch it again once it's up on the eOrganic website.
Mm-hmm. And we'll make sure to post some of the resources that Sarah talked about too on the page that you registered on too, so you'll have that. And I'm sorry to say we're pretty much out of time. I did want to note that there were some questions about summer annuals in the queue here, particularly to extend the season or to address the summer slump. And I just wanted to note that we have conducted webinars on those very topics. We had Faye Benson from Cornell who talked about forage brassicas as a way to perhaps extend the season or to address summer slump. And last year we had a specific session on summer annuals to address that summer slump period. So we'll make sure that those get up on the website as well, so that you'll have them as a resource for later. They were really, really solid webinars. So I would like to thank you all for your questions and mention once again that you can find that recording of this session, recordings of our other webinars, of course, as well as articles, videos, and more at eextension.org/organic_production. And with that, Sarah, thanks again for joining us, and thank you all for coming.